It's great to be joined today by Thomas Wood, who's an assistant professor of political science at The Ohio State University, also co-author of the forthcoming book, Enchanted America. It's so great to talk to you today, and I can't think of a better time to talk about the issue of conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy theories. We have sort of this coming together of a long history of decades of conspiracy theories in America. We have QAnon, and we also have conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones being thrown off of some of the prominent social platforms on the internet. So let's maybe start very, very broadly. What is included under the idea of conspiratorial thought and conspiracy theories? Is it just stuff like Paul McCartney died and a similarly sounding left-handed bass player has been filling in for him ever since? Or like how wide is the umbrella of conspiratorial thought?
So, well, first off, thanks for having me on. Thanks for having me on. I guess Eric and I, we approach thinking about conspiracy theories as any narrative which is all-encompassing, which explains a broad number of political events and is supported by little or no external evidence. And so that is like a useful enough conspiracy theory to account for things like that you've alluded to. So the idea that Paul McCartney has suffered an accident sometime in the 1960s, and an artist has been imitating Paul in recent decades, through to more damaging conspiracy theories, the idea that shadowy groups control U.S. finance, the idea that the 9/11 terror attacks were planned by elements inside the U.S. government for political purposes. And so the one sort of thread that we can use to join up all those different accounts is there's really no or very sort of weak evidence for any of these accounts. The absence of evidence is not really enough to disabuse its followers from believing in these accounts.
Another characteristic that seems common is that an absence of evidence or an apparent absence of evidence is often taken to be evidence because it's part of the conspiracy. In other words, either there doesn't seem to be evidence because the evidence is being covered up by the perpetrators of the conspiracy, so on and so forth. And that seems to make it particularly difficult to have sort of critical thinking and epistemologically sound conversations with some conspiracy theorists, because whether there is evidence or there appears to be or there appears not to be, it's all evidence of the conspiracy.
So, yeah, I mean, that's a very pertinent insight. Psychologists have spoken about this. They've called these conspiracy theories self-sealing. That is, the conspiracy theory has a thread to them which anticipates and responds to criticism. So, for instance, anytime an academic appears in sort of a public forum, the academic is instantly assigned a role in the conspiracy, and they're funded by the shadowy groups that support the conspiracy theory in and of themselves. And so in the past, when Eric and I have spoken about conspiracy theories in public settings, we're described as we're funded by the Ford Foundation, and we enjoy all the access to the Trilateral Commission, for instance. And I can assure you, like, I had to move my bicycle from outside of the shot before we had this conversation. I can assure you that I am the furthest thing from any part of like a global economic elite to be making this discussion. But I just want to make one sort of caveat with that discussion. That definitely is how the sort of the conspiratorial core sort of interface with these conspiracy narratives. By the time these conspiracy theories become public events and the average American survey respondent is aware of them, I've actually got pretty good experimental evidence which suggests that those sort of folks with a superficial engagement with the conspiracy, they're actually fairly amenable to evidence. So you can present them with, for instance, with you can show them pictures of Barack Obama's birth announcement that was contemporaneous to, that is taken from a Hawaii newspaper on the day of his birth. And that turns out to be very, very effective at moving people on this impression that Barack Obama's birth is subject to a shadowy conspiracy. But yes, when you talk about Q, for instance, so Q is, we're dealing with a conspiracy at its nascent stage. And those are folks for whom regular as you said, epistemic engagement on a scientific or at least fair basis. They're way too deep in the weeds to be persuaded by that sort of evidence.
One of the underlying sort of psychological imperatives that I think is connected to the desire to believe in conspiracies is the idea that it's somewhat more comforting to many people to believe that everything
Right.
is planned and crafted and managed in a way rather than to believe that random things happen, bad things happen. We don't always know the reason. There's a huge element of chance in how things go. Number one, do you agree that that is an element in people's belief in conspiracies? But what else psychologically is underlying belief in conspiracy?
So that turns out to be a very important thread for the survey evidence that we've gathered over the last decade. We went back and forth trying to figure out the best ways to predict the kinds of people who adopt one of the panoply of possible conspiracy narratives that are apparent in the American political discussion at any one moment. And you've hit on something which we found out to be a very powerful predictor. People who are anxious about their life personally, that is, people who wash vegetables when they go home, when they take them home from the market, people who lock the doors of their car as soon as they hop in the car for a drive across town, people who manifest those sort of anxieties in their personal life. Separately, people who are pessimistic about American society, people who are very pessimistic that we'll be subject to a terror attack in coming years, people who think there'll be a war between the United States or China or Russia, people who think we're on the verge of a recession. Those turn out to be very influential predictors of willingness to subscription to these kind of conspiracy theories. And we suggest it's like it's tapping something fundamental in human psychology. That is, we are probably the evolutionary descendants of those who were very attuned to unseen threats. That is, on the Pleistocene, our forebears who were very cognizant of a rustle in the bushes could be some predator, like waiting to pounce on our forebears and eat them. That was a very sound thing to do, to be very, very cognizant of and attentive to unseen threats as threats to our physical well-being. There's probably a good evolutionary story to suggest why we've selected on those threats. And it's really, Eric and I like to think about this as conspiracy reasoning. That's almost human psychology at its natural state. And so rather than having an appreciation for random chance, like separate forces coming together and resulting in horrendous things that take place and really which don't have much of a logical explanation, those are things we have to learn, and those are we have to sort of be made to be cognizant of and attentive to the possibility for those occurrences. And absent the sort of the hard intellectual work and natural state, it's much easier and much more natural to think of some simplistic conspiracy narrative which accounts for these separate events in one encapsulated form.
The term conspiracy theory is now being pointed to as part of the problem by some conspiracy theorists.
Right.
In other words, there's this idea that they like to say the phrase conspiracy theory was created to make people who question the official narrative seem crazy or seem lacking credibility or whatever the case may be. How can you address an issue like that head on, or is it even worth arguing that point?
So this is one of these complicated things. When I've done events like this previously, unbeknownst to me, I've often appeared with people whose sort of business it is to advance the particular the narrative of the day, and they've insisted on things like, no, I'm not a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. I'm a 9/11 truther,
Yeah.
or I'm a Barack Obama birther truther, and so. Those sort of labels to me aren't that meaningful. I think Eric and I use this terminology in our research just because it taps into something that most fair-minded people can see as broadly implausible accounts of politics. And so if that doesn't turn out to be the terminology that works for you in this particular case, that's fine. And so I think if it is the case that people get upset by this terminology, eschew the terminology and just look at the nature of the story as its adherents give it credit. And there you'll see stories that do sort of strain basic credibility.
I mean, I think one of the problems you very quickly come up against, you mentioned at the beginning when we were saying what counts as conspiratorial thought, what counts as
Right.
a conspiracy theory. You pointed to the lack of real evidence or objective evidence. The problem is that the conspiracy theorist believes there's plenty of evidence, and it immediately becomes a disagreement as to what counts as evidence. Like, I've been the target of the chemtrails conspiracy
Right.
theorists, and even though there are significant explanations of why what those trails are that follow behind an airliner as it flies overhead, it doesn't really matter because they say, no, look at all of this evidence, and then you're only arguing about what counts as evidence. So it seems like this totally circular exercise in futility.
Well, I'm guessing the people who've appeared on your show or have like risen to the profile to be engaged with you, those are people who, if they are good faith actors, you sort of have to wonder about their ability to engage on like any sort of scientific basis with other phenomenon. And if they're bad faith actors, well, then obviously, they have a business interest in ginning up anxiety and concern. I'm not so sort of equipped to provide you advice as to how you should like become a public intellectual, like seeking to improve public discourse. I can only provide you with indications for how the typical American survey respondent deals with this.
Right.
And there we can see conspiracy theories are, like you've said, they are a source of cognitive economy. And so they're not like learning the minutiae of, for instance, when the 9/11 conspiracy was a big thing, people would pore over the 9/11 report and the movement of individual actors and
Everybody's a structural engineer all of a sudden.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Oh, and then of course, then people start Wikipedia degrees in like how steel flexes, et cetera, and like chemical engineering. And so, no, that does not describe how a typical person who sort of just felt unease at the act of seeing like massive terror attacks in a major American city. Those regular Americans were not becoming like a sort of folk experts in steel and fuel sources. And so whilst that might be how people whom you met sort of engaged, the average American just thought, no, this event seems weird and awful. And that like a small band of motivated enemies of America could wreak huge havoc and kill thousands of Americans. That just seems implausible to me. It was more intellectually satisfying for those folks to believe that there was a shadowy American conspiracy at work.
When it comes to, as you mentioned earlier, disabusing people of their beliefs, there's one question which Peter Boghossian is a big advocate of. It's called the feasibility question, which is effective with some political views, which is what evidence, if I could present it to you, would change your mind?
Right.
Do you think that that is a good question for conspiracy theorists, or is it not a particularly useful one?
I think that's gosh, it's hard to say. So let's sort of bracket the question, the folks who are at the intellectual core of this, the folks for whom their day-to-day business is the propagation of these conspiracies. I'm not certain feasibility is the right thing for them. We've had some experimental success. It's just suggestive. There was on a small sample. We asked folks who were adhering to these conspiracy theories that have a strong partisan bent. He said, just switch the label. So if you believe a conspiracy theory about President Bush, Obama, or President Trump, make it about like the other president. And if that assails, so make the conspiracy about Republicans, make them about Democrats. Make the conspiracy about Democrats, make them about Republicans. And if at that point, if just something as simple as flipping the partisan label makes you far more circumspect about the conspiracy theory, people have some sense, well, gosh, there's probably a strong sort of partisan heuristic. I'm using my negative affect towards the other side of politics to stand in for something sort of more rigorous, appraising the evidence. And that turned out to be quite effective. I figured, no, I wouldn't be so likely to believe this conspiracy theory about President Trump if you told me it was about President Obama for Democratic respondents. And that seems to do at least some work.
One other sort of characteristic that I wanted to touch base with you about is that you will often see sort of an arbitrary focus either on the big picture or the details, depending on which is most convenient. And what I mean by that is you'll sometimes get a conspiracy theory and skeptics will start picking it apart by looking at the individual components, the micro components, and saying component one doesn't make sense, component two doesn't make sense. And then when you take apart 20 or different components, you say, hey, look, none of it makes sense. The conspiracy theorist in those cases will say, no, 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 you're missing the big picture. There's no way that this broad story could be true. The inverse is also true, where when you question the bigger picture, the conspiracy theorist will focus in on some individual unanswered questions, for example, that may or may not really have bearing on the bigger picture. Can you talk about that a little bit? Does that happen naturally? Does that happen because of how people react when put on the defensive, or is that calculated by the conspiracy theorist?
So, I mean, it's all speculative. You know, it's hard to sort of find enough of these folks. Like the folks who are there on the ground floor of these conspiracy narratives, the groups are so small. For instance, when conspiracy theories have been born in particular subreddits, you can do analyses, and the folks who are providing 90% of the content, 95% of the content, it's like 100 different user labels, right? So it's a very, very small band of folks who get these conspiracy theories off the ground. I guess I would provide two speculative answers to this question. There's a chance that these folks have sort of stumbled upon the methodology that sort of fairground carnival guys who promised close readings. That is, you walk into a room and I can tell you all these amazing things about a group of strangers, what we call cold reading.
Right.
I'm sure it's amazing. They use the identical style of technology to talk, for instance, about a group of people on one side of the room. Somebody over here has a father called Paul, and the exact same rhetorical strategies used to appear as if you are in possession of private knowledge about some group of people. It's a very, very close. And so it's also like the manuals on this, and the manuals on this are written by people who don't believe that they have like mystical powers. They are using it as a sort of a carnival trick, and so they're really, really impressive. They're really well done and really well conceived. They use the same strategies when you meet resistance. There are rhetorical strategies to sort of to deflect the conversation and realize, like, well, as you've said, I'm meeting opposition on the particular expectation I had. I can rhetorically turn this to talk about areas where I think I am better equipped. And the folks who have sort of risen to your level of your prominence to talk about conspiracy theories, they either know this research or they've stumbled upon a strategy that works for them. The other element of this is Leon Festinger and a bunch of other psychologists wrote about this in the 1960s. They studied doomsday cults who were comprised of folks who, small groups of people for whom the leadership made specific predictions about the impending doomsday next Thursday. And so when Festinger and his colleagues said, gosh, it must be the case that the adherents, the core, the leadership of this group must be sort of, they must be adherents, they must be believers, they wouldn't make contradictions that are so readily sort of contradicted in a week's time. But instead it's the case that in the anticipation of the event failing, the group actually grew stronger, more adherent to the belief, more adherent to the narrative when the predictions failed, when the prophecy failed, like, because it was an opportunity to affirm the group's hard work and the aliens who were going to attend Earth and occasion this apocalypse understood how much work we've been doing, and because of the adherence and belief that in this room they've chosen to delay the apocalypse for a year. And that turned out to be a fantastic selling point to the adherents. And so, again, I applaud you for making good faith, reasoned arguments. But for the folks who are at the absolute core, the absolute ground level of these conspiracy theories, we're dealing with a different epistemic set of evidence. And I don't think they'll be responsive in the way you anticipate and hope.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience. We've been speaking with Thomas Wood, who's an assistant professor of political science at Ohio State University, co-author of the forthcoming book, Enchanted America. Thomas, a pleasure speaking with you today.
And you too. Thank you.